Improvements in real-time graphics have been under constant development since the very first video game came out, and it's still being worked on to this day, despite how far graphics have come. But if you ask almost anyone, they're going to tell you that gameplay matters more to a video game than the graphics. People would much rather have a video game that looks bad and plays really well than the reverse. So why do game companies keep trying to push graphics? Why is that always the first thing that gets flexed, that gets shown off whenever a new console is coming out? Well, to understand why visuals are always at the centre of any major hardware developments, we have to go back to the very beginning. The earliest known computer game, Tennis for Two, was developed by William Higginbotham in 1958. It was just 2 lines and a single dot moving back and forth along the circular 5-inch display of an oscilloscope, a device for gathering information on electrical signals. Yet, despite this simplicity, it also tells you everything that you need to know to enjoy it. There was no way of keeping score, and the game would just loop again and again until it was turned off. But that core gameplay was fun, despite how basic the visuals were. Over a decade later, Atari would release Pong, which ended up taking over arcades and living rooms across the globe. The objective of Pong was the same as Tennis for Two: hit the ball back to your opponent, with the loser being whoever fails to do so. But Pong's visuals weren't being faked on an oscilloscope by playing around with electrical signals. An actual space with actual objects was being simulated by the hardware and shown to people through their screens. Of course, by the standards we have today, calling this a simulation is an extreme exaggeration. But back in the 70s, this was also a very big deal. This was huge. You could play this at home on a tiny little box instead of having to go out to an arcade and do it. Unlike Tennis for Two, the boundaries of the court are so clearly defined and the system's even able to keep score for you. But even in the 70s, there was very clearly room for improvement. It's only got a binary system of colour. It's either white or no colour at all. And developers knew that if they could utilise more than just one colour, they would be able to give more information to the player so seamlessly. More colours, better graphics would literally open up more better design capabilities. Graphics were integral to gameplay. Graphics are always integral to the gameplay. Lack of colour would be gradually improved. Games could only display a few colours at a time at first, but people were still impressed with every improvement that came. And it's important to consider that as gaming hardware grew more capable, the first thing that people would notice, without even understanding anything about it, was the visuals it could produce. You don't need to understand the intricacies of computer science to explain to someone why this is more technologically impressive than this. Like, sure, you could spend minutes, hours, explaining why your game is more technologically impressive than Pong. Or you could show them 5 seconds of footage and they instantly understand that it is more technologically impressive. Or it could be the latest in a very long line of low quality slop that causes a lack of consumer interest, which causes a lack of sales, which causes the entire games industry to collapse. Thousands of terrible games would flood the market, and good games became difficult to find amongst the mountains of poorly made slop that existed just to make money. So people just stopped caring. It simply wasn't worth the trouble. When the industry bounced back years later with the NES, it came with another big leap in visual quality though. The specs of the NES allowed it to make use of far more colours than the home consoles that came before it, but they were still limited to a relatively small amount. Even as developers got better at utilising the hardware and squeezing more colour out as time went on, a single cartridge could only hold so many colours in its memory. So more powerful hardware was an inevitability. But when more powerful hardware came, it came with competition.
Free, Super Monaco GP free, or columns free. What Nintendo?
Sega Genesis is 16 bits, 3DO is 32 bits, the Atari Jaguar is 64 bits.
The console wars of the 90s were a bloodbath of insults and trash talk that advertisers just wouldn't get away with today. They would often just straight up insult the competition, and one factor that would often come up is how many bits a console had. Of course, the average person has no idea what a bit means in this context, I certainly don't. But the NES was 8-bit, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis were 16-bit. More bits meant more powerful hardware. Bits were a big deal, even when 3D graphics were starting to become available. The Nintendo 64 was named because it was a 64-bit system. And when it comes to computer hardware, a number going up almost always means it's better. So as long as you can point to those numbers and you have the biggest one, your console is a surefire success. Right? Statistically speaking, the most powerful console of each generation very rarely comes out on top. In fact, there have been plenty of times where the least powerful console has sold the most units, and that applies to handhelds and home TV consoles. Time and time again, it has been proven that, whilst important, graphical capabilities just aren't a huge priority for people when deciding which console they should buy. So, why do console manufacturers and game developers and publishers keep pushing it? Well, that's easy. It's because visuals are an immediately understandable thing that you can show off. You don't need to be an expert in game development to understand that the fact this is running in real time and this is completely playable is impressive. Graphical capabilities have been getting considerably better and better and better and better for decades, but as time has gone on, the actual tangible improvements have been gradually slowing down. The difference between Marvel's Spider-Man from 2018 and its 2023 sequel is profoundly less immediate than the difference between 2001's Grand Theft Auto 3 and 2008's Grand Theft Auto 4. Now, to be fair, there is a noticeable visual improvement between the two Spider-Man games. The PlayStation 5 sequel can run at double the frame rate, double the resolution with higher polygon meshes, higher resolution textures, and so many minor details. But those improvements are so much less immediate than what we used to see between prior console generations. That's not because developers aren't trying, or because they're lazy, or whatever some guy who pays for Twitter with an AI-generated profile picture says. If anything, these developers are working just as hard, if not harder, than they've ever done. It's because they're running out of extra details to add, and those extra details also take more time and work to implement. More time and work means that more staff need to be hired, which means more money being spent on development. So now, yeah, games look better, but they also cost more money to make and take longer to get released. So long in fact that by the time it comes out, people might be sick of whatever trend your game was chasing. It's important to state that visuals are not the only factor in how long a game takes to release. In January of 2025, Jason Schreier released an article that goes over pretty much everything as to why games take so long nowadays, so I'd highly recommend reading that. Video games are arguably the most complicated form of media to produce. If any video game goes through a full dev cycle without any friction or difficulties, that's considered a miracle. But that need for every video game to be bigger and better than the game that came before it is starting to prove destructive and detrimental, and visual fidelity is at the core of that. When a game is so large in scope that it takes 5 years to develop from start to finish, it means that any change in direction will make the game take even longer, and when a game takes 5 years to develop, that's 5 years of employee salaries. That is a lot of money. they frankly don't have the resources available to pivot. They don't have the opportunity to respond to changing trends in the industry. No studio can afford to fail. So every game needs to be a guaranteed success from the moment it's pitched. Otherwise, the entire studio is at risk of shutting down. Hell, the game can be a massive success and your studio still shut down. But safe is also boring. It's uninteresting. People are getting tired of playing the same open worlds and live services over and over again. Ubisoft is on the verge of collapse in no small part because almost every game they've released over the past 15 years has followed the same stale open world formula with a realistic visual style. For the most part, these games aren't even bad, people are just sick of how homogenous AAA games have become. But for years, they thought that the open world was a safe bet because games like Skyrim and Grand Theft Auto 5 sold gangbusters. But open world games are incredibly ambitious feats. You have to fill almost every inch of play space with something, whilst also taking so much time designing to account for just how versatile the open world structure is. Add that into how much time it takes to make assets to what is now the standard, and projects just balloon in scope, they balloon in budget. Someone has to make all the tiny clutter models, but there are so many that they won't have time to texture them all, so someone else needs to make the textures, then someone else does the physics, then someone else places them into the world, but only in this section of the map, while another designer is doing it for another part of the map, using different models and different textures that completely different members of staff made to the ones I just mentioned, and it's like that across every facet of development. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people on the payroll, causing development budgets to skyrocket to an amount that would require maybe 5 million sales at least to turn a profit. But let's say that the game is a success. It sells 10 million copies at $70. After marketing, platform share and licensing, let's just say it made maybe $100 million profit. And that's probably being generous. So what's next? Probably another game, right? But you can't just do the same game again. Fans want more. They expect more. Because the last 3 games that you've developed have been bigger, more ambitious and better looking than the game that came before it. But that also means a bigger budget, and the latest game, while successful, only sold around the same amount as the last few games. Even if the next game sells just as many copies, that's less profit overall. Keep following that pattern and the next game released could be your best seller, and simultaneously flop so hard it closes the studio. But there's another factor to consider. All this time I've talked about the money that goes into making the game, but not the money from the people buying them. At launch, an Xbox 360 cost around $300, and a PlayStation 3 cost around $500. The Xbox was ahead in sales for most of the generation until a cheaper PlayStation 3 was available. For the next generation, the PS4 and the Xbox One, the prices were $400 and $500, but with the cheaper option now being the PlayStation. The PlayStation 4 dominated that generation, at least until the Switch came out for only $300. These prices and sale numbers aren't a coincidence. The price of the console is such a significant factor in how well it sells. But the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X both released for $500 for the full console with a disc drive. Yes, there was a cheaper option available for each one, but they had considerable drawbacks. The standard console was considerably more expensive than it used to be, but now, because of the inflated development budgets due to all the factors I've been talking about, publishers raised the price of games from $60 to $70. That's even more money people are having to spend for something that's basically a better looking version of something they played 5 years ago. Yes, prices increase over time, that's how inflation works, But in most countries, wages have not increased at the same rate as inflation. Everything costs more money than it did 20 years ago, but wages haven't gone up to reflect that, so people can't afford as many luxuries as they used to. Buying a PlayStation 5 in 2020 was a bigger financial commitment than buying a PlayStation 4 in 2013, and that's before factoring in the damage COVID lockdowns did to the global economy. But 6 years later, and those development cycles resulted in comparatively fewer major games being released for these consoles, so the entertainment value from buying a PlayStation 5 over a PlayStation 4 is significantly worse. But those new games have now been designed to account for the extra horsepower of the PlayStation 5. Many of them need that extra horsepower. Players now expect their games to look like real life at 60 frames per second. Developers are expected to make every game look better than the last because that's just what they've been doing for 50 years. But that expectation is starting to outweigh the financial cost, and it raises the question: do we even need better graphics anymore? Let's take a look at Crimson Desert. Up until launch, the only thing I'd really heard about this game was that its graphics were incredible. And I suppose the cheering from the worst people online over a woman getting punched. And yeah, can you really look at this and point out anything in the visuals that needs improvement? I can't, at least not without pointing to the frame rate and the resolution, but let's be realistic for a moment. For even high-end TVs, I'm talking like giant 80-inch displays, anything that could realistically fit in the average living room. None of them need to be any higher than 4K resolution, and 4K is frankly being generous. Yeah, it's nice, I love my games running in 4K, but the cost of 4K at 60 frames per second is so much now. I spent £2,000 on my PC, and it struggles to run most games that came out in the past 2 years at 4K 60, and that's even with AI upscaling. Oh fuck, I gotta talk about AI. We can't just ignore the impact AI has had on the world. Back in 2021, DLSS was like black magic. At the time, it seemed as though this revolutionary new tech was going to allow games to hit higher resolutions and higher frame rates for far cheaper. But, rather than using it to help games run better, they're expected to run and look better. And now, games need the latest AI upscaling to run well on hardware that's just a few years old. But, functionally, they don't really look much better. I genuinely think that Monster Hunter Wilds only looks marginally better than World in most cases, but it has to flaunt the latest graphical tech, and so it ends up running way worse at the same settings, even with DLSS. All the benefits AI upscaling was meant to allow for have just been absorbed back into the same problem, because every game has to look better than the last, even if the visual difference is negligible and the performance is considerably worse. The AI boom is proving disastrous for everyone but a select few. The cost of hardware components is at an all-time high because every tech company is using the whole supply to build data centers, meaning that if these next-gen consoles release on schedule, they will have to cost more money than any console has ever had because their components are at such an inflated price. And all of this is happening when people have significantly less money to spend because they were laid off, replaced with the same AI that caused the price to go up. The same AI that is starting to cause games to look worse than they did 10 years ago. But we're stuck in the console cycle. It's always been this way. And until now, it's worked. So Sony can't not release a PlayStation 6. But millions of people still play games on their PlayStation 4. New games are still coming out for it because the PlayStation 5 still costs too much for most casual gamers to bother with. A PlayStation 5 Pro is $700, except an hour before I started recording this, it got raised to $900. But at least that's marketed as a luxury. Yet the average person can barely justify spending $500 on a base PlayStation 5, and that price has gone up to $600. And aside from AI upscaling, really, what the fuck can they even offer? Higher frame rates, I guess, but most people's TVs can't go any higher than 4K and 60Hz. Like, most people aren't going to be able to make use of higher frame rates. They're not going to be able to appreciate the higher frame rates. They won't even be able to see them because their TVs just don't support them. The only people who will be able to notice or care are a very small minority whose money just simply won't be able to offset the increased development costs of a game that can effectively make use of that. Genuinely, as of now, I don't think there's a point in releasing another console generation. The cost of the improvements is simply not worth it. As publishers continue to push higher visual fidelity, the rate of improvement gets slower and slower, whilst costing more and more. We're now at a point where games released today don't look that much better than games released 5 years ago, yet the cost of playing them is exponentially more. With that in mind, who wants a PlayStation 6? Who wants whatever Project Helix is? I don't. I kind of want a new PC, but I'd rather have new games that look as good as the games I played 5 years ago that run just as well. But I don't see that happening. The games industry has reached a point where everything has to be better than what came before it. Even if that means everything has to be worse.